The Manor House, Little Chew in Oxfordshire. A large sprawling house built of Cotswold stone, set in a wooded garden with high yew hedges. It was here in 1914 that a remarkable woman was born, and it was here too that she died in 2015, aged 101. Her name was Nancy Sandars. Nancy Sandars had a long and remarkable life, both here in the village that she loved and also travelling widely abroad. Nancy Sandars was an eminent archaeologist specialising in prehistory and the Bronze Age, and a respected author with a fascination for the arts. She was a poet too, though her poetry was only published in recent years. In the summer of 2014, her large garden at the Manor House filled with her friends and family as we celebrated her 100th birthday. And we all have memories here, but what's lovely is today is another memory, which is a shared memory of Nancy's 100th birthday, and we know it's 100 because she got her card from the Queen. Nancy Sandars was my godmother. My grandmother was one of her closest friends, and 4 generations of my family have visited the Manor House at Little Chew. Nancy Sandars' books on prehistory have become standard text for the study of ancient civilization in Europe and the Middle East. Her translation of the Mesopotamian poem, The Epic of Gilgamesh, was published by Penguin to wide acclaim. She is remembered particularly for the accessible and lucid style of her writing that engages the reader and brings past times to life. The Manor House in Little Chew was Nancy Sandars' family home for her entire life.
See the drawing room.
Not denying it.
Oh, that's a wonderful one.
Well, this is your favourite. The coffee's your favourite.
It was on her 99th birthday in June 2013 that we asked her to look back on her eventful life, which began at the time when Europe was bracing itself for conflict, because the year of her birth was
1914 in this house, and it was before the war, but the war was expected. Everybody knew it was coming.
Nancy's mother was Gertrude, or Gertie, Phipps, a tall and beautiful woman with a keen interest in the arts. She married Edward Sandars, an officer in the Royal Artillery, who had seen action in the Boer War. In 1911, Sandars was given the job of finding the horses that provided the army's transport. Horses supplied for military service were called remounts.
And he was doing a great survey of remounts in 3 counties, one of which was Oxfordshire, and that was why he had to find a house in Oxfordshire. And my mother said, I don't mind where, so long as it has a view, and this house has no view at all. However, it was a nice house, and they were very happy.
Josephine Walker is Nancy's cousin.
Well, now, this is Nancy's older brother and sister, the twins, Betty and Hughie.
Wonderful hats they've got.
Wearing the most extraordinary frilly hats, sun hats, lovely. And here again with them, identically dressed, because I think in those days you didn't dress boys and girls differently at all. The twins were absolutely delightful, and here are the twins on their donkey. I don't know if they're on the same donkey or 2 different donkeys. I suspect it's the same donkey. They were about 7 when Nancy was born. And Nancy is a very small baby with the monthly nurse, Hughie wearing his sun hat.
Looking very straight, with probably his father's tie.
And sadly, Hughie died very shortly afterwards. Nobody quite knows why he died. So Nancy really doesn't remember him at all. She only had about 3 months of her life with him.
And do you think that, as in those days, Huey was never really talked about?
I understand that it wasn't, yes, you clamped down on it, you didn't talk about it.
Nancy lost the chance of having an older brother. But as she grew up, she formed a very close and supportive bond with her sister Betty that lasted throughout their lives. Neither of them ever married, and they lived together in the family house in Little Chew. Nancy was close to her parents too, but having nurses and nannies was very much the norm for a family of reasonable means, and day-to-day childcare could be delegated to domestic staff. Her father was also needed in London.
My father was called up into the War Office and they had to move to London. But although they moved to London, my nanny and I stayed here for quite a long time, though we did go up quite often to London too.
It was one such trip that formed Nancy's first memory.
My earliest memory is one of rage, because I was being wheeled in a pram by my nanny in Hyde Park or Kensington Gardens, I don't know which, and I was sitting up and enjoying life, and I was made to lie down, and I was furious.
Perhaps an early sign of the feisty independence that was to characterise her later life. At the end of the war, in 1918, the family moved to Romsey, near Southampton, where her father was given charge of a large operation receiving the horses that returned from France. Many of the surplus horses were available for racing and hunting, part of a social scene that the Sandars family warmed to.
My mother loved country things and she loved hunting. She adored horses.
The family moved back to Little Chew, along with a number of the horses. Nancy, now turned 5, learnt to ride, encouraged by her mother. Her education, however, was rather piecemeal and informal.
Her early education was self-education, a lot of it, I suspect. I don't think she got a lot of education from school, because I don't think she enjoyed school.
She received some teaching at home.
There was a wonderful girl who came on a bicycle from North Aston, and she rode over and taught us. She was a very good teacher. And then I went to a school called Luckley, which was near Wokingham. But I was there for 2 terms, and I didn't like it at all. At least the first term, when we played hockey, which I enjoyed, I liked. But the second term I didn't like very much.
This is a photograph of a school play at Luckley. One of the elves is clearly a 12-year-old Nancy. A review in a local paper commented, "The play went with spirit and natural movement throughout. The dances of the fairies was exceptionally pretty." But Nancy left the school after the summer term. She also started to have problems with her eyesight.
Well, I began to have trouble with my eyes. Very good eye man said I'd got tuberculosis in the eye. So I went to English sanatoria first, and then I went to Switzerland.
I'm not sure how they treated it. It did gradually improve of its own accord, although I think she always had a certain amount of difficulty with her eyes. It didn't actually stop her doing what she wanted to do.
Even if there was little formal schooling, there were other activities for a young woman of her standing. There was, however, a choice to be made.
I was given the choice of whether I would like to hunt, because hunting was the great thing, and we'd had ponies, we'd grown up with ponies. And either could do that or I could travel. And I said I would like to travel.
And there was no choice. Travelling, of course. Hunting was fun, but travelling was important.
So then I started from then on, and I went to my first journey was actually Germany, but it was in 1930, I think, before Hitler had taken power.
Nancy was sent to an establishment in the German Rhineland town of Jugendheim called Die Klause.
Her sister Betty had initially gone there to learn German. It was a sort of, not quite a finishing school. No, definitely not a finishing school, but it was a couple of ladies who owned a largish house in Germany and had foreign young women and possibly young men, I'm not sure, to whom they taught German, and they took them to the opera, they took them to museums and galleries, and were instructing them in civilized, cultured life.
Nancy made a number of trips to Die Klause in the early 30s. The economic and political situation in the country was a concern to her, even as a 16-year-old. In a letter home to her father, she wrote, "The state of Germany just shows how much worse it can become, and to all intents and purposes will become. We in England look at things, shake our heads, and see no way out." Within a year, the Nazis became the largest political party, enabling Hitler's rise to power. Nancy travelled elsewhere in Europe, in the early days with her mother.
She and I were particularly close because she loved travel too, and she took me abroad to some places.
They made a number of trips to the Swiss Alps, including the picturesque Lurchental Valley. She wrote back to her father, "Oh Dad, this is too marvellous. A view of all the peaks around was a thing to be dreamed of. Yesterday I sat on a rock in the evening and watched all the cows file by, with their bells, all sizes and tones." Back in their hotel, Nancy and her mother each produced a watercolour of the views from their window. In 1934, they also made a trip to Vienna. But the political problems of Europe were never far away. Their visit coincided with the February uprising.
There was a bit of a revolution there while I was there. And it was the Social Democrats. And there was the great Karl Marx Hof was besieged. And there were guns, and at night we could hear troops tramping through the streets.
As the Austrian army continued to crush the socialist uprising, Nancy and her mother left Austria and travelled on to Budapest before returning home to Little Chew. But Nancy's travels with her mother came to an abrupt end a few months later. In 1934, Gertie suddenly became ill and died. Nancy was 19 years old, a few days from her 20th birthday. This, for her, must have been devastating. A year passed, and this photograph was taken at her 21st birthday party, her coming of age. Her mother is conspicuously absent from this family group. In the next few years, Nancy continued to travel, with friends or on her own, writing back to her sister Betty and her father. One of the trips she made in 1936 was to Spain, but again the political upheaval in Europe intervened.
I went to Spain on the beginning, it was just the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. And although all the people we had introductions to were royalists, really. A friend who came with me, we came back being thoroughly anti-royalist and in favour of the Democrats.
At this time, Nancy was 22, an age when young women could be expected to think about marriage. Nancy never did marry. I asked Josephine if she knew whether there had been opportunities.
No, she was extremely tight-lipped about romance. I suspect there were people that were interesting. And one or two people of her generation have said, did she ever go any further with A, B or C? I think not. She had this extremely close relationship with her sister. And I think she always, all her life, felt that she couldn't abandon her sister. So even if there had been a man, I think that Betty came first.
But her father felt that his two unmarried daughters should be protected and transferred ownership of the family property to a trust.
Her father set up a trust when his wife died. There was now not going to be a son, a man to take over the estate. And so he set up a trust which meant that the land and the house and the cottages would be in trust so that they had the income from the estate, but they didn't own the estate outright, which was meant to protect them, but which caused difficulties later on. And it made Nancy rather unhappy with it, but it had been meant as a protection for her and her sister.
It was at this time that the idea of studying archaeology came to Nancy.
I think my first interest had always been in history, and I loved the history of the Middle East particularly. But I had the idea that, of course, with my eye trouble, I wouldn't be able to read enough to do history. So perhaps digging would be easier.
On a fine summer's day, the idea of sifting through soil for ancient remains has its attraction. Through her sister Betty's contacts at Oxford University, Nancy arranged to join the excavation of an Iron Age hill fort at this spectacular location in Shropshire in the summer of 1939. It was here, on Wrekin Hill, that Nancy started her career in archaeology. She joined Kathleen Kenyon on the Iron Age dig.
Kathleen Kenyon was at Somerville and worked with Mortimer Wheeler, and they had a very good technical approach, and I was attracted by this. It's the actual way you excavate, you find objects and place them. Very detailed plan where everything is.
The Wheeler-Kenyon method used a grid system to map archaeological finds within different strata of the soil. From this, a chronology and dates can be inferred. At the Wrekin, the Iron Age fortifications circled the hilltop. This path leads through what was the southwest gate to a permanently settled area. In their excavations, archaeologists identified different periods of occupation here, with some pottery pieces dating back to the late Bronze Age, a prehistoric period Nancy became drawn to.
It was a wonderful sight because you looked down from a great height and you could see right the way to Snowdon.
But this was the summer of 1939. Nancy's plan to pursue her new interest in archaeology was disrupted by the threat of war in Europe.
We were there just in July, and I'd been going to leave it to go and join Mortimer Wheeler, who was digging in Normandy. However, as soon as I got home, I saw all about what was going on, and there was no question of going on with that. Instead, I had an SOS from Kathleen Kenyon saying, "Come to the Institute and help me pack up. So I went up to London to the Institute, and the Institute is a lovely building in the middle of Regent's Park, and it had big basements, and that's where there were cases, and Kathleen stood in the basement, and I threw all the pots and sherds and all the things that are on display upstairs in the Institute, and Kathleen caught them, and I don't think there were any casualties.
In fact, the Institute and its treasures survived both the hurried packing and the London bombing. But as World War II set in, Nancy had to decide whether to get involved in the war effort. In her travels, she had seen the rise of fascism in Germany and witnessed fighting in Austria and Spain.
Well, to begin with, I had very strong pacifist feelings. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to take any part in it. So I tried nursing, and that was no good. So I said, what else can I do? I'll ride a motorcycle. They wanted dispatch riders. So friends got me a motorcycle, and I learned to ride that, and I joined a thing called the Motorized Transport Corps, and we were taking over from some very tough dirt track racers, and they were very good and kind to us.
Being a wartime dispatch rider was not an easy option, as one of Nancy's letters to her father and sister makes plain. Dear Dad and Bets, if Monday the world was good to me, then yesterday I saw the other side of the picture. It started raining at breakfast and got harder and harder. The rain was so heavy it hurt on my face. I could see practically nothing. My back wheel was sliding about on the surface of the road. I dared not use my brakes at all, and soon I had not one dry stitch of clothing. I got to Fareham, my first call, and found the letters wet and pulpy, but delivered my first. On to Gosport. Did a beautiful skid on a corner going very slow, and also a slow motion fall. Unhurt, only the machine lay on me so heavily I could not get out from under it till someone lifted it off me. Nancy's early wartime exploits were full of events like this. Travelling in the dark with her headlights shrouded. She remembers getting lost on Salisbury Plain, heading towards what she thought were crossroads, but it turned out to be a T-junction, and she crashed straight through the hedge. In 1942, she decided it was time to try something different to dispatch riding. She wondered about enlisting in the Wrens.
So I went to the Wrens, went up to, and they said, I was very sorry, there's nothing for, nobody wanted except stewards and cooks. Unless, of course, you were only German, so that was my chance. So I said, yes, I know German, hadn't thought of German for years. However, they gave me something to read, and I read it rather fast and rather colloquial English I put it into, and then I saw I was coming to things that I couldn't possibly read. So I looked at my watch and I said, oh my goodness, my train's going. And they said, that's all right, take it with you and send us what's right. So that's what I did. And so they accepted me then in the linguists, which was very, very hush-hush then. You weren't allowed to say what you were at all.
Nancy was now part of the Wrens Y service, a series of intercept stations that reported to Bletchley Park. She was sent to the south coast near Dover to listen in on German wireless traffic.
We were listening to E-boats, and we knew a great deal about them. And we even knew the names of their commanders. There was one called Willy something or other, And as well as listening and taking down what they were saying to each other, we did direction finding. That's to say, we took bearings on what they said, and so were able to pinpoint where they were.
An accurate position meant the E-boats could be attacked.
Yes, I remember one was given compliments on your work last night. Meant that there, and you heard someone say, "Wir haben 6 Schwergeschwister." We've got so many badly wounded, we're going home. That sort of thing, so you knew what was going on.
But how did this square with her early pacifist leanings?
Well, you see, I discovered that when you were really frightened, you would rather kill than be killed. So after I'd been in air raids, I knew that I would rather kill than be killed. And that was worked out in this work very well, because I did know exactly who I was fighting against. We knew them by name.
While Nancy continued her intercept work on the south coast, her father's health declined, and in 1944, he died. In 1945, as war was ending and demobilisation approached, Nancy, now 31, wondered whether to return to archaeology.
My Wren officer had connections, and so she encouraged me and said, "Why don't you go back?" But, of course, I never passed an examination. How was I to start? How was I to get in? And so I set to work, and I passed London Matric, which is the sort of A level, I think, more or less, so that I could go to the Institute in London and work for a diploma in archaeology.
The Institute of Archaeology had a new director, a rather strange man.
There was a very remarkable man called Gordon Child, who was an Australian, and he was a communist, but he had been an anthropologist in Edinburgh, had been the professor there. He was not beautiful. He was a very strange looking, but he had something I could only call a rather old world manner. Very, very delightful manner. He was appointed to the Institute of Archaeology in London, and he had there Kathleen Kenyon and Mortimer Wheeler, and they all had this reputation for special techniques. So I was told, why go to the Middle East that you are interested in? They're very old-fashioned there. They aren't using the new techniques. You go to the Institute in London and you'll learn it there.
Gordon Child was an enthusiast for the Wheeler-Kenyon method of mapping finds in a three-dimensional grid.
He was a very good teacher, I think. In fact, I enjoyed being taught by him.
But what of Child's political views? Did they appeal to Nancy?
No, not at all. Didn't really take them very seriously. But he was very serious about having the Daily Worker, had the Daily Worker brought to him. Oh, yes. But we rather laughed at that. But I'm afraid it did affect his career. But quite a lot of the London University people were rather shocked by it all.
Nancy had an opportunity to put the new skills Child had taught her into practice when she travelled to the British School of Archaeology in Athens. This was an outpost of the London Institute, which had reopened in 1948 Its deputy director was a young man called John Boardman. Could you tell me a little bit about the British School of Archaeology in Athens when you were there?
It was a lovely house. It's a beautiful house. It's a good garden, which it shares with the American School of Classical Studies. So it's a patch of greenery, not all that far from the centre of Athens. But at that time, Greece was really still at war. There was still a civil war going on, so life was really pretty austere. And although we had this very fine building, we really had not all that much to eat. We were living on bean soups and things like that much of the time. And there was only hot water once a week for baths. And to keep warm, we used the tennis court as much as anything as a place to keep warm in. But life in school was good. Magnificent library, of course, which was carefully being kept up. So we could do most of our work there. It was a good life. We travelled as much as we could. One set off very bravely into the unknown. A lot of it done simply by walking.
John Boardman remembers Nancy's arrival at the British School in 1952.
And it was then that Nancy began to appear upon the scene as a visitor to the school, usually bustling off somewhere to travel and look around the place. Those were years too when the director was Sinclair Hood. Sinclair was running excavations in Chios, the island off Turkey, at Emporio, with a magnificent site with everything from sort of earliest Neolithic to late Byzantine. And Nancy visited us there.
When I started work in Greece, my first work was at a dig in the island of Chios. And there I got bitten with Greek things.
Nancy captured her new enthusiasm in a letter to her sister Betty. "This must be the world's most beautiful place. I sleep 1 yard from the plashing edge of the Aegean, see the sun rising over Samos, bathe twice a day in an exquisite empty bay." My arrival was memorable. My instructions what to do at the end of the bus ride were extremely uncertain, but I carried an envelope with 3 words written on it. Pergi, the town where the bus would deposit me. Emporio, the little bay some 6 miles further on. And the third, Zoo, which you probably know means animal, and which was to carry me and my luggage from A to B. At 6:45 we arrived at Pergi. A tiny donkey was produced, my luggage put on, and I also had to ride a little way.
That's very, very evocative of Emporio and what you saw of it. And it was almost a sort of rather romantic excavation in a way, although it was very, very hard work. And for food, the little harbour there was the base for lobster fishermen, so that you can get tired of lobster, in fact, after a while. But it was the most remarkable range in sight. So there was the harbour down below with a little acropolis, which had on it a late Roman town, a walled town. And opposite it there was another hill where there was another little archaic village of smaller houses. And we climbed up this, and there seemed to be bits of stone here and there, and which had been worked. And then we came out to a little bit of a plateau, and we said, well, this is where there ought to be a temple, and there it was. In fact, two courses of the stone still standing and visible, and then right up to the summit at the top. I think anybody who went there and spent any time there were very much moved by the whole occasion.
Nancy was to make several trips to excavations in Greece and Britain, working under the guidance of Gordon Childe. But in 1956, Childe resigned, a year sooner than expected, and went back home to Australia. Nancy and her colleagues then received some rather strange letters.
We all had letters from him in which he said he was going to the Blue Mountains, and he said something about it being very easy to slip in the Blue Mountains. And then, of course, we heard he'd fallen and was dead. And we all first said, no, this was an accident. But of course it wasn't. He had killed himself. And it was partly because of the new archaeology. I think he knew that with carbon-14, everything would be changed, and everything was going to be far more technical, scientific, and that there was no place for him anymore in archaeology.
Carbon-14 dating measures the amount of an isotope of carbon in organic objects to give an estimate of their age. This gave archaeologists additional information about the objects they found, which led to theories of the ebb and flow of ancient civilizations. This was increasingly something Nancy became interested in.
I never really took to excavation, to digging itself. It wasn't my thing, really. What I was interested in was the connections between one place and another, one area and another area.
In this, Nancy was encouraged particularly by the archaeologist Stuart Piggott, who had taken over at Edinburgh from Gordon Childe. The two of them corresponded frequently and later travelled together. Nancy's interest now centred on the civilisations of the Bronze Age in Europe, and her studies took her in a variety of directions.
Nancy continued her connection with the Institute of Archaeology in London and in Athens. She also studied here in Oxford at St Hugh's, where she completed her B.Lit degree in archaeology.
In the 1950s, St Hugh's was one of the few Oxford colleges open to women, and Nancy studied here between 1950 and 1952, and again from 1958 to 1960, focusing on prehistory. A key question facing prehistorians is, how far can you go in theorising about ancient civilisations when all you have are the remains of a few of the objects that they made? As Stuart Piggott observed in one of his letters to Nancy, there is no such thing as historical truth, only a meaningful arrangement of the evidence at our disposal. Nancy addressed this issue very elegantly in her writing from this time.
The thesis that Nancy wrote for her degree, Bronze Age Cultures in France, was published as a book in 1957. It received excellent reviews. In the preface, she suggests, "Prehistory is algebra to the arithmetic of history. It calculates in unknown quantities, but the processes of calculation are the same."
At St Hugh's, Nancy studied with the newly appointed Professor of European Prehistory, Christopher Hawkes. He, like Stuart Piggott and Gordon Childe, would have shaped Nancy's views at this time. Megan Price teaches the history of archaeology at Oxford.
Can you tell me a little bit about Christopher Hawkes' relationship with Nancy?
Christopher Hawkes was a great influence on Nancy. He seemed to guide her in the right direction, and they seemed to think on the same wavelength. He wanted to break down the insularity between European countries in the way that they looked at archaeology and the way that they interpreted archaeology. He felt that everyone should be able to speak 2 or 3 languages, and therefore communication about knowledge and artifacts and practices would be so easy. Nancy, of course, backed this to the hilt.
What did you make of Nancy's thesis?
Well, what Nancy has done, of course, is examine very, very carefully and very, very accurately all the different designs and the markings of the potteries, and then she has sorted them into some kind of typology and also some kind of category, so that you could then follow where these people were according to their trademarks or their particular signage on their pots.
Nancy's technique of meticulously organising and categorising finds to throw light on prehistoric civilization could, she felt, be applied elsewhere. In Greece, there was a wealth of objects being excavated from ancient graves.
So I set to work. What was needed was to organise the finds from some of these tombs. At that time, the great site was Mycenae, And there they dug up wonderful burials. And I started work on these, and I started work on swords. And I made a system of numbering and organising them all.
In 1955, Nancy was invited to join an excavation on Crete, undertaken by Sinclair Hood, the director of the British School at Athens, and a young, newly graduated student, George Huxley. The three of them are the authors of a paper describing their dig, which was in an olive grove where a hole had suddenly appeared in the ground, suggesting an undiscovered Minoan tomb. George Huxley and his wife Davina now live in a village near Little Tew, where they became close friends of Nancy and Betty.
Oh, yes.
How about some coffee then?
That would be very nice.
I asked George to describe the excavation in Crete that Nancy and he were involved in.
There were many tombs, I recall at least 18, and they were excavated in the course of the late summer and early autumn of 1955.
The site turned out to be a whole cemetery of tombs, many of them containing interesting Bronze Age objects.
What was particularly interesting for Nancy was the discovery of razors, pins, and other bronzes, which were her special interest. She had a very good visual sense. It's enabled her to see typological development, which is very important from the point of view of any, as it were, evolutionary approach to archaeological artifacts.
Many of the tombs held bronze swords and daggers, and Nancy focused particularly on these and began to see a distinct pattern in the changes in these weapons.
I think what most impressed me about her study was the demonstration that the Minoans, who had really very short swords or daggers, were strongly influenced towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age in Crete by seeing on their journeys to the Levant much longer and more effective swords. And they, with great enterprise, developed swords of their own, which also were used on the mainland of Greece quite soon after that. Her work on swords undoubtedly is classic and fundamental. I don't regard that as an exaggeration at all. Something that is classic endures, and she is still being cited on the subject of swords.
Nancy's work on Bronze Age swords was a great academic achievement that has stood the test of time. But she had other interests that she also wanted to explore.
I think it was always I wanted to write. It was always literature I wanted. My mother wrote and all the family wrote, so that it was rather, yes, rather inevitable that I should want to write too.
Nancy had been writing poetry for much of her life, but most went unpublished until she was in her 90s. One person she did share some of her poetry with was my uncle, John Fuller, a poet, novelist, an emeritus fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford.
She wrote with a kind of professional scope, really. I mean, she was an ambitious and industrious poet. The usual range of poems you would expect a poet to write. Yes, personal poems, particularly gravitating towards Little Tew, poems of nature and landscape, yes. Certainly poems of connected with archaeology, about prehistory. Many poems of, I suppose you would call it spiritual journeying.
Her poetry was eventually published in a volume called Grandmother's Steps. I asked John to read an example.
Well, I thought I would read The Ear's Map. There is a map of the ear with the eye's map coterminous. Not flat and not extension only, it has relief, valleys of noise, the all-night moan of caged machinery, din of canned voices amplified, from which its soaring heights are silence. an instant's hush, its precipice, the early morning and the evening hour, a plateau land of singing, bleating, calling home. Cars go too fast ever to see the gossamers they burst. Sundays and holidays, and in the peculiar hush of earliness they rest. Then distance is not measured. It is depth perceptible to ears in soft recession to the round rim of silence. Uplands are not so many miles apart, but linked by almost out of earshot bleating of this flock to that, and every milking brings the hillside home. There's such a lot going on in that poem that seems very fine to me. I mean, particularly that last line, which is a perfect iambic pentameter when there haven't been any in the poem up till that moment. And every milking brings the hillside home. Like a line out of an 18th century landscape poem. And the lines about the pool, without mentioning a pool, perceptible to ears in soft recession to the round rim of silence. The reader will know what is going on without being able to immediately put their finger on the idea of the ripples in a pool. What is also interesting about the poem, incidentally, is that because of her troubles with her eyesight in learning Braille, because they thought she might go blind and so on, clearly sound became tremendously important to her, and this poem about hearing the map of the landscape around her is an original idea, I think, done extraordinarily well.
Nancy combined this understanding of poetry with her fascination for prehistory to take herself off in yet another new direction. She wrote a new translation of the ancient Mesopotamian poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was published by Penguin. I asked Oxford University poetry academic Jenny Lewis how this came about.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest story in the world that's been actually written down. It's about a god king called Gilgamesh, who's very beautiful and heroic, but who's a bit of a tyrant. And he goes on lots of adventures with his best friend. It's the original buddy movie, really, because he goes on lots of adventures with his best friend Enkidu. He, because of hubris and challenging the strength and greatness of the gods, his friend dies, and the second half of the book is mainly about Gilgamesh wandering in the wilderness, absolutely consumed with grief for Enkidu, and also fear of his own death.
And how was this written?
Well, it was written down. The Sumerians were the first people to actually invent writing. And they wrote it down like this, with sharpened reeds, and they made wedge-shaped marks on the clay, and cuneiform means wedge-shaped. And this is one of the tablets they found buried under the sands with the Gilgamesh story on it. And at first they couldn't decipher them, but eventually they broke the code, and once they'd cracked the code and could decipher it, several rather scholarly versions were produced.
What did Nancy actually do?
She couldn't actually read cuneiform, she couldn't decipher cuneiform herself, but her aim was to make a version that was accessible to a wide readership, and not just the more scholarly versions which were concentrating on how the symbols were formed and what, you know, it could mean this or it could mean that. She wanted to make it into a coherent story that would grip the reader from page one. I think what she also brought, because of course Nancy was a poet, a very fine poet, and so she understood the importance of poetry in the epic, which some of the scholarly versions don't really reflect so well. So here's a very good and highly regarded version by Andrew George of when Enkidu dies and Gilgamesh goes off into the wilderness, and he does this extraordinary lament. Hear me, O young men, hear me, O elders of teeming Uruk, hear me, I shall weep for Enkidu my friend, like a hired mourner woman I shall bitterly wail. Which is interesting, it does tell the story, But here's Nancy's version, which goes one step further, I think, as a poet, and grabs you by your poetic heart, if you like. Hear me, great ones of Uruk, I weep for Enkidu, my friend, bitterly moaning like a woman mourning. I weep for my brother, O Enkidu, my brother. So you can see the difference.
That's lovely. Yes,
it's very beautiful, isn't it? I think that had a huge influence in the fact that many more people were able to read it and relate to it. It sold over 1 million copies, which for a poetry book is absolutely phenomenal in itself. But it's caught what people see to the original intentions of the text, which is to move people and to tell a story that's going to stay with them for the rest of their lives.
Through the 60s and 70s, Nancy continued her work in archaeology. She travelled extensively, seeking out ancient artefacts from the Bronze Age and boldly going where others had not dared to go.
We wanted to know what was going on beyond the Iron Curtain. We had rumours of wonderful discoveries and excavations and things. And so I travelled with Stuart Piggott, Terence Pearl, John Cowan to Eastern Europe. We went from Romania, we went to Armenia and Georgia.
The British Embassy warned them to expect harsh conditions in the communist countries, but Nancy and her party were lavishly entertained by the academics they met.
We were fed on caviar and wonderful food and looked after marvellously.
Here she is with academics and archaeologists in a forest in Romania. Their journey in 1966 took them on to an excavation at Lake Savan in Armenia, where remains date back to the 8th century BC. The information Nancy gained on trips like this led her to tackle one of the great puzzles of prehistory, the sudden disintegration of a number of established civilizations around the Mediterranean.
In the Bronze Age, there were great civilizations. There was a civilization in Egypt, and there were the Hittites in Anatolia, and there were different places, people in different places. And that all came to an end very suddenly, around about 1200 BC. And what had brought it to an end? And that was these people called the Sea Peoples, invaders who came in to Anatolia and Palestine. And the thing was, where did they come from and who were they?
Much of this work involved sorting fact from fiction. Stories from Greek and Roman mythology, such as about the Trojan War, have parallels with tales of the Sea People. I asked George Huxley how one knew that the Sea People had any basis in fact.
There's no doubt there were sea peoples because the Egyptians talk about them. They may not have called them sea peoples, but they certainly called them invaders and a thorough nuisance requiring massive defeat in the Nile Delta. And Nancy had a very cool head about all that. She knew how to interpret legend in historical terms, but she never took it too far. I think she thought I sometimes went too far with that. That was useful for me. She put a brake on again. That's an example of her natural common sense and wisdom.
Nancy published her research in 1978 as a book, The Sea Peoples, Warriors of the Ancient Mediterranean. It is a highly readable account of what the archaeological evidence tells us, drawing particularly from her travels in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, examining artefacts such as pottery and swords. She concludes that the Sea People were not a single force, but a succession of invading or raiding groups that added to the weakening of civil organisation and brought about the collapse of previously strong empires. In her later years, Nancy continued to write about subjects that interested her, based at her home in the village of Little Chew. The upstairs room that had once been her schoolroom was her study, and a number of learned articles and publications emerged from here.
She merged with the local, as it were, rustic life of that corner of Oxfordshire very, very well indeed. And then from time to time, another slim volume would appear on a totally different subject from what the last one had been. You know, I had to think, well, is this sort of dilettante approach? But no, it was profoundly scholarly. She didn't do things by halves. It means that her slim volumes are still authoritative and I think read and used by people.
While Nancy's highly readable books on antiquity open up an ancient world, her life at home in rural Oxfordshire traces a whole century of recent social history.
Little Chew is a small village set in farmland about half an hour from the academic city of Oxford. Nancy and Betty lived at the manor house, while in the adjoining cottage was their former nurse, Flo, and her husband, Arthur, who was the handyman and gardener. Together, they were collectively known as Nurse and Arthur, and they helped Miss Nancy and Miss Betty maintain their house as a cultural hub for the many visitors who were invited to call and stay. In many ways, the two Sandars sisters were continuing the tradition of being at the centre of village life, established in the 1920s by their mother Gertie.
She had a great gift of friendship. She had many, many friends. Great interest in the theatre too. We had acting here. We put on plays, and she wrote plays to put on here. There's one I remember particularly that began, "Where be I now? I seem to know this." And she went on, and this was Mr. Waugh. These were all local characters were brought in.
Ernest Waugh was the local builder. He was recorded in the 1960s reminiscing about his early days in the village.
Of course, we used to have a blacksmith at Little Chew one time, and there was a wheelwright in the yard there, and also a carpenter there. See, they're all gone now, that is. There were a lot of children about in them days. There were about 60 on Little Chew School in them times.
Mr. Waugh also had memories of the Sandars family home, Manor House.
No, all Manor House. I remember when, well, you know, I'll picture that now, to look at it now, and when I used to go fetch milk when it was like a farm.
Yes, and I'm thinking it was a farm.
Yeah. I used to go to that back door and fetch the milk, and then where your study is, that was the kitchen, you know. There was an old, great old pump in there, I remember, and a big trough where they used to pump the water in. And it's quite different now, though. That was all done away with, wasn't it?
Well, it stayed the kitchen for some while after we were...
Yes, yes.
This last voice is Betty Sandars. The manor house had been modernised and extended by the Sandars family in the 1920s. On his retirement from the army, Nancy's father, Edward Sandars, had become a figure of authority in the locality.
He became very much involved in local politics and in the running of the school and the church and that sort of thing. So they were living up to the fact that they lived in the manor house, and therefore they were important in the village and the area.
Nancy and Betty continued in roles of some influence and had many connections in the world of art. For example, Nancy kept up a long friendship with the artist and poet David Jones. His modernist poetry drew on his experience in the First World War, while his drawing, painting, engraving and calligraphy explore complex, often religious themes in a wide variety of styles. Nancy corresponded at length with him, exploring the intellectual ideas behind his work. The Sandars sisters also encouraged other local artists. One of these was Jeff Clark, based in Oxford. Jeff had worked as a draftsman recording archaeological finds in Crete, and she had a fascination of ancient Minoan craft.
It's a Middle Minoan vase, but it's a lovely example of the organic nature of Cretan pottery and design. And I used to think of it distinctly different from my painting, but actually in 3 hours' time I was going to get off into the landscape and paint.
Jeff's exuberant use of colour captured the intensity of the Mediterranean light, and the Sandars sisters bought a number of his works.
And I love it because it picked up all the boxes.
They also invited him to Little Chew to join their gatherings of the intellectual great and good.
Well, when I first met them, everything was a journey into a new social world for me, you know. Being a lower middle class boy with shoulder chips, you know.
To meet all these people who functioned in a very different existence, but were very really interested in what the people, everybody around them.
Yes, absolutely fascinating, really. And I grew into this world, which was very supportive of my art.
Nancy and Betty's wide network of friends included my own family. My grandmother Cicely was a very close friend of theirs, as was my mother Rhaenyra, and my aunt Prue and her family.
Another regular visitor with Cicely, my grandmother, was my step-grandfather, Philip Hendy. He was director of the National Gallery and wrote several of his books in the Manor House dining room, as his handwritten note recalls. I frequently visited Little Chew with my own children as they were growing up, adding a fourth generation of my family to appreciate the loving friendship of Nancy and Betty. Nancy's circle of friends included people she'd encountered on her travels, such as the anthropologists John and Sheila Campbell. They had studied the nomadic Sarikasani people of northern Greece, and Nancy had joined them on some of their trips in the early 1950s. The Campbells moved back to Oxford with their daughters Fiona and Sarah, who now look back fondly on their visits to the Manor House.
As children, we were given absolute carte blanche to do what we liked, when we liked, go anywhere in the house, up and down into the attic, which was filled with fantastic uniforms. It was total freedom. Nancy was always very ebullient, and there were always wonderful conversations, but it stretched from anthropology to archaeology to religion to history to politics. Nancy's politics was always controversial to my mother because Nancy was quite left-wing, my mother was always quite right-wing.
Other friends came to live in the village, such as the archaeologist Rachel Maxwell Hislop. She became a neighbour and an enthusiast for village events such as the awarding of the Little Chew Cup for services to the local community. Between Rachel and Nancy sits Abbot Conway, a Canadian expert on Anglo-Saxon who was also the vicar. Others met Nancy and Betty for the first time on moving to Little Chew, like the writer Peter Buckman.
I think they were introduced as the ladies of the manor, so I looked appropriately reverential. But I should explain, this was the early 70s. I had a kind of afro and probably wore flares. And we met these, looked like two elderly ladies from Arsenic and Old Blaze, but they were completely surprising. And when we first came in the village, Nancy and Betty were the centre of it, the social centre, but also the kind of moral centre. And they were always the ones who made sure if there was anybody who needed something, it was obtained for them, that people without cars were taken to the doctors if they needed it. And they always invited new people for drinks to get to know others in the village.
Newcomers to the village included the new vicar, Halsey Colchester, and his wife, Roseanne, who arrived in 1981. Interestingly, they had both had a secret career in British intelligence, and Roseanne had worked at Bletchley Park in the war. Their first meeting with the Sandars sisters also caused quite an impression on them, as their daughter Chloe recalls.
And I remember them saying that they'd met this extraordinary pair of sisters who were dressed in sensible tweed skirts, lisle stockings, and who were both wearing headscarves tied in the Swedish fashion. And I think it's fair to say that my mother saw the role of being a vicar's wife as rather playing a role, because for most of her life she'd been married to somebody who was working in British intelligence. Her role was something she wasn't entirely at ease with. And what she valued about Nancy and Betty was that they'd lived in the same house for most of their lives. and that there was a sort of authenticity to them. Nancy was very in touch with her childhood self, and she could recall it very vividly, and she could recall scenes from her childhood very vividly, such as the day when she refused to go to school, standing under the apple tree. And I think it was that sort of sense of continuity that my mother really appreciated. I mean, one of the things about Nancy was that she was always very aware of things happening around her. So when you went round to see her, she would show you a rose that had just come into flower. And of course, in the evening, she'd take you to see the evening primroses opening. And so there was this very strong sense of place, but it wasn't all romantic. She was also aware of the tougher sides of what was going on in the countryside. And she was also alert to the difficulties that people were facing in the village.
Little Chew is a small village of about 60 to 100 houses. It was a mixed community with some rented accommodation available to those working on the land or in the locality. When retired district nurse Sarah McRae and her friend Jill Adenall needed a home, they were able to rent a cottage from the Sandars sisters. But Sarah's close friendship with Nancy took a while to develop.
She seemed quite fierce to me and quite daunting. But I didn't know her well, very well read, and stupidly, I thought, I wasn't good enough brain-wise to sort of be her friend, but she soon put that right. But later, really, I got to know her when Betty was very ill and went into hospital, and Jill and I used to take baskets of Earl Grey tea and stuff in for them while they were sitting together in hospital, and I tweaked Betty's pillows a few times, being a nurse, and trying to make her more comfortable. And after Betty died, Nancy relaxed somehow. She'd really looked at how people were missing Betty and almost felt that she wanted to continue the relationship with the village because she cared so much about what was going on there.
By the 1990s, it was clear that the village was changing. The rise in property prices meant there was a lack of affordable accommodation for people with a link to the village who wanted to stay here.
I think it was felt that we couldn't lose the cottages in the village which people could afford, which poorer people could afford to rent, really, so that we continued to have ordinary country people as part of the village. And I think it's just a healthy mix, isn't it? When social strata all mix together and find value in each other, and I think that's very important.
It was suggested that some affordable housing could be built in Little Chew.
And Nancy actually offered a plot of land, and unfortunately there was a campaign by weekenders, led by weekenders, to scupper the notion of affordable housing.
I think it was wonderful that they tried and looked into it and tried to build affordable houses, but it just wasn't to be.
And it was the start of a very long and bitter division in the village, which took a very considerable time to heal.
As the village moved into the 21st century with its exclusively more affluent residents, Nancy still welcomed visitors to the manor house where she now lived alone. But she was no longer able to drive and became reliant on assistance from friends and neighbours.
And that was when the family realised that she was going to have perhaps some carers coming in or living in if she was to stay at that house.
In the garden, you've been into the garden. Yeah.
So, with a series of carers supporting her, Nancy was able to spend her final years in the house that she had been born in.
Come here because of the badgers.
In 2013, a small tea party was held to celebrate her 99th birthday. Sinclair Hood, who had led the excavations in Greece in the 1950s, was there, as was the anthropologist Sheila Campbell.
Nancy, happy birthday! You've got to blow them out.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all, dear friends. It's so lovely to see so many dear people.
The following year, we celebrated her 100th birthday.
I think the main point is that Nancy's always welcomed so many people to this house, and some have come through her academic life and some have come for tea and for the garden, and the house has always been somewhere of incredible welcome and love and kindness.
So many of us were able to remember the treasured times we'd spent in Nancy's company here. But finally, a year later, aged 101, Nancy died, leaving us to reflect on the remarkable person we had known and the gifts she had shared with us all.
I see Nancy as a woman who was able to share her knowledge, her wisdom. I could always say, explain again, Nancy, I didn't take that in. She'd do it, and she was so good at it, and I think we've lost this person who could relate to everyone.
Nancy was interested in people's minds. You always came away thinking that your brain had been revved up.
She had an ability of binding together the antiquity and the modern world. And the more she understood about antiquity, I think the more she understood about the world around her.
She believed passionately that art reflected life, and that if one was to write about art or archaeology, that one must capture that sense of life and write about it in a lively and a sort of entertaining manner.
After her death, a number of Nancy's unpublished poems were found, and my aunt and uncle, Prue and John Fuller, published them in a volume called Evening Primroses. One poem was written shortly after the death of her sister Betty in 1995. In it, Nancy explores the nature of dying, perhaps looking ahead to her own eventual demise. I asked John to read it.
This poem, Semper in aeternam, o mea cella vales, it takes its title from a poem by the 8th century monk Alcuin, who lived in York. It's about leaving forever one's sacred place. Last night, I watched the evening primrose open as so often we have done. I wondered if you saw it too, remembering our pact. The quiver and the sudden spring, then open to the evening air, the growing dark. Oh, were you there? You heard the blackbird begin his months of song. You saw the swallows and the martins come. You heard a cuckoo once or twice. You missed the morning glory and night-scented stock. You saw the evening primrose open and the roses one by one. The thrush was singing still when you left home. You did not leave. You are still here with everything you love. And me, the thrush, the lovely ringing thrush, singing to wake the dead. Not so, the attentive dead have heard, interpret him aright. Our thrush, still ours across what chasms of eternity. We advance together, you one step ahead. I will be coming after. You went ahead and so removed the fear and dread. Whatever company you keep with friends or family or saints, you will still hear that old, small wail, me too. Semper in aeternam, which is forever. Together again, if ever again, or never again, or yet perhaps forever, again together, again.